Primary and secondary sources. Primary and secondary sources. Ohio is America, Chapter 1.4. What do you think this object is? What do you think it represents? What details could you share with me about how you came to your conclusion? If you're looking at this, what do you think it's made out of? How large do you think it is? We know that it's actually about 8 inches tall. Does that change your thinking? Here's the back side of it. It is an effigy pipe. It is the state artifact of Ohio. Do you remember what an artifact is? It's something that is left over that represents something, or something from an earlier time period, or an event. This artifact was found at the Adena Mound, which is a giant burial mound in Ohio. It is a pipe shaped like a man. It has a hole drilled from the top to the bottom. Here's the Adena Mound prior to excavation in 1901, over 120 years ago. This pipe was used to smoke tobacco. However, archaeologists do not know much more than that. Historians have to piece together the past using sources such as this. Today we're going to learn, and here's the picture of when it was excavated. I found it down in the dirt in the mound. Today we will learn what sources are, the difference between primary and secondary sources, and how sources are used to make historical narratives. First, we're going to learn about primary sources. A primary source is any historical source that tells us about history. So a historical source is anything that tells us facts about history. A primary source is direct or first-hand evidence about the event, the object, or the person. Examples include artifacts like the effigy pipe, things that can be held or touched, or things like this marriage record on the right-hand side. This right-hand side marriage record is from 1886. It is a marriage certificate for Thomas Edison and Mina Miller. What could you tell us about Thomas Edison and Mina Miller looking at this? Well, if I look closely, I can see that they're talking about the 23rd day of February in 1886, that they have pledged together to be married in the state of Ohio in Summit County, and they were married on the 24th day of February. William McKinley's Civil War diary is another example of a primary source. William McKinley wrote this first-hand account on June 15th of 1861 of a Civil War instance or event. So another type of primary source, not only are artifacts primary sources, or things that are recording things from first-hand accounts, but statements taken directly from people who saw or lived through an event. Examples include diaries, letters, or autobiographies. The last type is first-hand accounts, records or records from around the time of an event. So think about the diaries that you might be writing at home right now. Someday they'll be a primary source of your account when you were this age. Other primary sources can be images, videos, drawings, and photographs. Obviously, those sources are super and help us learn a lot, but we do know that things go back in time before photographs even were available or before videos had come into play. So sometimes we have to look at images and drawings. Secondary sources. What's the difference between a primary source and a secondary source. Primary source and a secondary source. Primary means a first-hand account. If historians don't have enough records from a time period, they can also use secondary sources. So if they can't find another first-hand, they can also look at second-hand evidence. Secondary sources are created by studying primary sources and gathering information about an object, an event, or a person. So in other words, I could read all of the newspapers from at that time. Now, newspapers can be a little bit tricky because if a reporter was at the event and wrote the article in the newspaper about something that happened because they were right there and they saw, perhaps there was a horse and buggy accident in the middle of Main Street and they happened to be there and see it happen. And so they wrote about it in the paper. That would be a primary source. However, if something happened and they heard about it from somebody else, that would be a secondary source. Primary means that somebody is actually there, right there when the event is occurring. Secondary means that they've heard it from somebody else or somehow found out about information. Examples of secondary sources include encyclopedias, documentaries, biographies, and textbooks. Here's another example of a secondary source. This is written about Thomas Edison. Now, it was published in the newspaper, so why is this not a primary source? Well, it's not a first-hand photograph, it's just an image, and it was written in 1931 after Edison had passed away. So in this case, we know that this can't be a primary source, it must be a secondary source. Historians decide whether a source is primary or secondary depending on how close to the event it was written. The older a written account is, the further apart the date can be. Historical narratives. Look at this picture from Ohio State University. This is Ohio State University football game. Look how the player is dressed and look what he's holding on his lap. Look at the people sitting on the bench next to him and the people around him. Look at the people in the stands way behind him. This can give us some information about early football. It's very different than it is today. Look at the clothing. Look at the fans. Look at what they're sitting on, the wooden benches, and how they've got their feet on a wooden board to keep them out of the mud. Notice there's no astroturf or grass. A historical narrative is the true story of a historical time or an event. Sources are used to create these historical narratives. Historians try to use as many primary sources as much as they possibly can. So in other words, if I wanted to learn more about Ohio State football in the 1920s, I would try to seek out as many sources as I could and as many primary sources, meaning maybe interviewing people that were there or finding information like this program or this photograph, or finding reports from a reporter who was actually in the stands at a game, and compiling all of the primary sources to be able to put together my historical narrative, which would be the true story of that particular Ohio State game. Here's a souvenir dedication program. It's from an Ohio State versus Michigan game in 1922. What can this tell us? Well, looking at it, we know that we don't see the Horseshoe Stadium that we currently see if we look at an Ohio State stadium. So we know that the stadium has changed much over the years. It also tells us that Ohio State and Michigan played football against one another clear back in 1922, so almost 100 years ago. Secondary sources are used to explain and interpret facts secondhand. Everything we know about history is from sources. So there's many different ways to look at learning information from history. Primary and secondary sources are very important in doing so. Hopefully this will give you a little better information of primary or first-hand account and secondary or second-hand or second or third-party account.